So thank you all for joining today. Happy Monday. We're really pleased to have Dr. Luis Valdez join us to give our guest faculty research seminar. It's part of our series from the Rutgers Global Health Institute, as you know. And I'd like to give I'm Rick Marlink, and I'd like to give a brief introduction of Dr. Valdez. If I could, Luis, before we hand it over to you. And Luis Valdez is an assistant professor in community health education and serves as core faculty in the Center for Community Health Equity Research at the School of Public Health and Health Sciences at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's also the co-founder and associate director of Nosotros Comprometidos a su Salud, Committed to Your Health, which is a program within the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. This program was developed to foster community-engaged research, collaborations, service, and education to advance health equity. Luis is a first-generation Mexican immigrant trained in health behavior and social epidemiology. He specializes in using community-engaged, multi-level perspectives and mixed methods approaches to understand and address the impact of systemic processes that involve racial and ethnic disparities in historically marginalized populations. He's interested in understanding how individual level experiences interact with macro level characteristics to influence the health-related behaviors of Latino men. Received his PhD in health behavior, health promotion, again from the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, University of Arizona in Tucson. So thank you, Luis, for joining us, and we'll hand it over to you, and we'll assume we could jump in with questions, but I know we're going to leave time at the end for questions and discussion. So, Luis.
Thank you, folks, for having me here today. And yes, absolutely, please do jump in with questions. I'll do as best as I can to sort of field the questions and the sort of the presentation that I have prep for today, and I am going to leave enough time at the end for questions as well. So thanks again, and I am about to share my screen here, so just a sec. This is always a moment, and then if I can get a thumbs up if you can see my slides, perfect, and a thumbs up if you can't see my notes. Great, beautiful. So thanks again for providing me with some space to share a little bit about my work. I do like to give you some positionality of who I am in order for you to best understand sort of where I'm coming from and why I use the perspectives that I use. So, you know, I do want to start by acknowledging all of my relations, past, current, and present. I am for them and by them. And I moved through this space with the intentions and sort of prayers of my ancestors. And what I'm going to talk about today is intersections of science and community, and how we leverage our collective strengths towards real, grounded, and sustainable impact with some of the most vulnerable populations. I'm going to cover again a little bit about myself, my approach, some history of my efforts, and then I'm going to cover what I'm currently working on and excited about. Again, I'm originally from Tucson, Arizona. I was born and raised in the US-Mexico borderlands, and before I ever entertained the idea of a career in public health, I was a community organizer in Southern Arizona. I existed sort of at the intersection of being indigenous, having been undocumented for a large fraction of my life, being a first-generation immigrant, and the first person in my family to graduate high school. Growing up poor, also created a sense of accountability to community and to work toward educational and health equity, which is some of the efforts that I was involved in. That said, my public health career really started on the ground and now straddles sort of the academy. And when we talk about marginalized communities, There's us as researchers, and then there's them, the communities who we work with. In my case, the opportunity to get an education surely has provided me with some privileges, but I'm still of the communities that birthed me. My family and most of the people that I've ever known continue to live the harsh realities of what we study and try to remediate here. My trajectory in community engaged health research is rooted in the best interests of community. And so before anything else, the core principles of my work are centered in protecting that. For those of us coming from a school of participatory work, this sort of a trending source of grounded knowledge that exists in community is centered in the concept of citizen science. So that's where, we're talking about this Barrio science. This is the idea that folks in the community can build the knowledge base, but because the word citizen can be pretty loaded, particularly because most of my work is in Latinx communities, I like to call my approach Barrio science. And it's really rooted in creating research community partnerships that value this knowledge and that can position this knowledge toward innovative and community-led solutions to persistent and complex problems. And my approach to Barrio science is that it's, my work is not top down. So nothing about community without community is for community, that it's not extractive, that all information that's gathered is in the best interest of community, that should enhance and improve community. That it's not fixed, right? That all the work that we do is future facing, that it evolves to meet community needs, which always evolve, and that it's not appropriative, that the ownership of research should be retained by community, right? So we move in academic space with community knowledge, with the permission of the communities that we work with. Since my training at the University of Arizona's College of Public Health, my scholarship has been centered in ideology and intervention-based work toward understanding and diminishing the burden of health disparities. This has really manifested itself into youth participatory action research-based programs with indigenous youth of the Pascoyaqui tribe in Tucson, Arizona. YPAR is youth-led, and so our work has really centered in fostering much-needed intergenerational discourse around behavioral health and youth substance abuse and youth suicide prevention. Simultaneously, I was traveling back and forth to farms in northern Mexico, working with migrant farm workers from central and southern Mexico. I've led the qualitative components of larger mixed methods assessments of discrimination and racism, working in living conditions and their collective impact on health, particularly stress, depression, anxiety, and substance use and misuse in migrant farm workers. Nevertheless, the large majority of my work has been working broadly with men of color, and more specifically with Latino men. My work really encompasses chronic disease and alcohol abuse disparities in heterogeneous groups of Latino communities, Latinx communities in the U.S. Northeast, Southwest, and Southeast. I also work in the areas of stress and chronic disease, etiology and prevention with men of color in the U.S. Northeast, which is where a large majority of my work is taking place now. And my emerging area of work, which is the development and testing of gender transformative interventions for minoritized folks. And this is currently in the Northeast, and we're working on an expansion right now. And you'll learn a whole lot more about that as I move forward. So why the Latinx community? Low and no income Latinx communities in the United States are disproportionately burdened by chronic disease, alcohol, substance misuse, depression, anxiety, chronic stress. The Latinx community is the largest and fastest growing minority group in the US, and it's grown from 50.5 million to 62.1 million in just the last 10 years. So it continues to expand. And then why men and Latino men specifically? So the life expectancy for Latino men in the US is 5.2 years lower than that of their Latina counterparts. And behavioral and environmental factors play a large role in that. Without pathologizing folks, men are more likely to smoke, abuse alcohol, engage in violence, and engage in high-risk behaviors, eat poorly, hesitate to see a doctor when they're ill. Latino men die at higher rates than Latina women from heart disease, unintentional injuries, all kinds of unintentional injuries of all kinds, as well as chronic liver disease, drug overdoses, and suicide and homicide. So it's become increasingly evident that this life expectancy gap is due largely to preventable causes. And even more clear is this idea that some of these preventable causes of death are at times due to archaic ideals of masculinity. So again, without pathologizing, my work and that of colleagues suggests that Latino men that adhere to more patriarchal ideals of masculinity, like toughness, self-reliance, emotional disconnectedness, also are reluctant to practice healthful behaviors and seek care when needed. While we can attribute some of this hesitancy to issues of knowledge, as well as access and availability of services, the work has consistently shown that the more Latino men identify with these traditional notions of masculinity, the more vulnerable they can become. And then this is in fact worse when compounded by the dire effects of racism and discrimination and other systemic issues that disproportionately plague these folks. So when I started my doctoral work at the University of Arizona, there was a growing need to establish an improved and mutually beneficial relationship with the Latinx community, and particularly with men. This relationship needed to be sort of for us, by us. And that's where Nosotros was born. And Nosotros comprometidos a su salud, or committed to your health. And Nosotros is supposed to encompass kind of like all of us, right? We're building a collective of people that blur the line between the academy and the community to really do community engaged work. I, along with my research partner and collaborator at the University of Arizona at that time, established this network to meet the needs and to improved collaborative research relationships with this community in Tucson and in Southern Arizona, and it's continued to expand since. As the associate director of the program, a large part of my push was and continues to be the development of improved communication strategies with and for the Latinx community, particularly with difficult to reach Latino men in mutually beneficial chronic disease related work. More importantly, however, beyond simple communication strategies, everything we've ever done with Nosotros is out with the community. And so we go out into the community, we meet people where they are and engage people one-on-one, which is way more important than sort of any content messaging strategy that we could have developed. This, of course, is more resource intensive, but it's an approach that works. And it's an approach that we've created a very nimble and versatile model for, and that we've been able to use in different places in the US successfully to engage this particular group of folks. And when Nosotros, we've been able to straddle multiple approaches to chronic disease etiology and intervention development. And we've been able to make this happen through improved non-extractive model for community engagement that carefully considers all the social contexts of the Latinx community in Southern Arizona and more recently in the U.S. Northeast and the U.S. Southeast, working in specifically in South Florida. And we've developed the Animo study, which is a tailored weight management program for Latino men, which was at the time the first chronic disease prevention program of its kind to be developed for and exclusively recruit Latino men. Our success with that program has led to several follow-up projects, including our work on an R1 with folks from the Center for Research on Men's Health, previously at Vanderbilt, now at the newly established Racial Justice Institute at Georgetown. And this work was also at the foundation of my doctoral work in exploring the intersected multi-level factors that lead to alcohol misuse, treatment, and seeking behaviors in Latino men, as well as now auxiliary projects that I'm leading related to the exploration of manhood, masculinity, machismo, and as health behavior driving constructs for this population. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and focus on the contributions to a larger NIMHD funded project in collaboration with the Men of Color Awareness Program, or movement, as folks involved in that project like to call it. And this is a program out of Springfield, Massachusetts. And now we're sort of fast forwarding to my efforts at the University of Massachusetts. And so MOCA is a true grassroots organization, and for the better part of the last 12 years, MOCA has been working toward the primary objective that they've created, which is to reduce the health disparities of men of color in the city of Springfield, Massachusetts. And since 2010, MOCA has brought together cohorts of low income or low and no income, mostly Black men, with the aim of improving the health of men of color. MOCA aims to decrease this chronic disease by strengthening stress coping mechanisms, And this includes challenging gender role stereotypes, critical consciousness building, expanding the range of practical coping skills, of stress coping skills, and as well as anger management techniques. And then we also bolster civic engagement, social connectedness, and resilience toward building collective advocacy. And so it's a multifaceted sort of really, it's community and individual based intervention. MoCA does this by applying their core beliefs, so that this is the idea that disparities can be changed, that we approach our work with an awareness that society forces men into this man box that then results in that health detrimental behaviors, and that we need better models of a healthy manhood and masculinity. And lastly, that men can disentangle their masculinities and get out of this man box and become agents of change in their community. And this is a case, we're working on this because low, no income Black men are also disproportionately burdened by chronic disease. Black men between the ages of 35 to 70, which is the group that we work with here, experience the highest rates of chronic disease, have some of the lowest life expectancy compared to other gender and race ethnicity groups. And they die disproportionately from heart disease, cancer, and stroke, and now from COVID-19, right? So this is sort of pre-COVID-19 times. The findings of our previous work shows parallels with the literature and suggests that differential health outcomes in Black men stem from this complex interplay of fundamental systemic, social, cultural, individual determinants, particularly those that are related to race and gender. And so based on our previous and ongoing work of expanding a minority stress model, we set out to explore how chronic disease disparities in Black men are driven disproportionately by exposure to high levels of stress, and which are rooted in a complicated intersection of factors, including poverty, discrimination, racism, and patriarchal notions of masculinity. So for the purpose of this work, we consider stress as the functional impact of adverse environmental exposure. And so this sort of stress-inducing exposures can include routine pressures related to family, work, significant life changes, or something like being stopped by the police, traumatic events, discrimination, social isolation, exposure to violence or natural disasters. We also need to consider the degree of impact that a stressful event has on us really is dependent on some sort of an innate or acquired ability to cope with that stress. And also really need to consider that not all stress is bad. Think of what you need when fleeing a predator, right? We've developed these stress coping mechanisms as a matter of survival. The key here is that this should be a reaction to an event. So while not all stress is bad, chronic strain on your body from stress may contribute to serious health problems. And so that constant stress, constantly being on, the body never receives a clear signal to turn to normal functioning. And so it has a dire impact on immune, digestive, cardiovascular, sleep, reproductive systems. And then we see stress and chronic stress in particular as a key mediating factor that links macro level social structural forces to micro level behavioral factors that then lead to these negative physical and mental health outcomes, as well as negative social outcomes. In Black communities, folks are disproportionately exposed to chronic stress, which is associated with the wide range of psychological and physical issues. And evidence shows that these disparate burdens are due to historical and contemporary structural and social inequities. And so in 2016, we at UMass and MoCA received an R01 to conduct a CVPR-based investigation. So that's community-based participatory research investigation of stress and chronic disease prevention in older, lower, no income African-American men with three overarching objectives. The first was to get a better idea of which factors needed to be included in the expansion of this minority stress model that we were developing to help us better understand the types of stress that Black American men are under, and how folks cope, as well as what are the stress pathways that lead to gaps in a variety of health outcomes. The second was to evaluate the effectiveness of a standard MOCA curriculum compared to an experimental narrativized curriculum based on peer-to-peer storytelling. So very briefly, our experimental condition of this narrativized version of the MOCA curriculum is based on storytelling rather than didactic communication. So we believe that with certain populations, and Black American folks being one of these populations, that the sharing of stories as a way to communicate pertinent health information holds a lot of value and has proven effective, an effective way of health risk communication. And so we've narrativized the entire curriculum and have delivered it as such. So the MOCA curriculum itself is designed to address multiple facets of health in an integrated sort of 10-week program that includes weekly hour-long discussions that facilitated group reflections of Black masculinity, stress, violence, depression, substance abuse, along with classes on health topics that are pertinent to chronic disease prevention and self-care. A really important part is that the program was based on 18 months of formative work that included the completion of 40 individual interviews, 14 life histories, and then 37 digital storytelling workshops. The result of 3 different workshops. There was 37 digital stories that were composed by participants that all yielded data that would help us put together this final tailored and responsive curriculum. So consistent with these CBPR principles, the MOCA mentors at all African-American men with deep ties to the community recruited a large majority of men to participate in these workshops. So we had active and passive recruitment strategies, and we had to adapt to COVID as well, changing a lot of like our in-person recruitment strategies to virtual recruitment strategies, which are also now part of sort of our process and our approach that we are now testing some of the communication strategies there as well. And our primary research outcome is point prevalence of cortisol extracted from fingernail samples. So these biomarkers can provide us an objective marker of stress levels and help us overcome some of the limitations of these self-reports that are historically have been shown to be unreliable, particularly with communities of color. However, data on perceived stress also was assessed using a depression and anxiety scale, or the DAS-21. And then because the standardized MOCA and MOCA Plus, or the Story Matters, or the narrativized version of this, they were designed to address multiple risk factors simultaneously. BMI, casual blood pressure also were measured as part of our stress sort of creating a larger picture of reaction to stress. And then, so the list on the right here illustrates some of the scales that were used to assess psychosocial measures hypothesized to influence our primary outcome. And these measures were completed by participants at each of 4 time points as well. And so we have the male role norms inventory, conformity to masculine norms inventory, gender role conflict scale. And so we're really focusing on self-conceptualizations of manhood and masculinity and how they change throughout the course of this work as well. In brief, during this project, 261 men were randomly assigned to the control or experimental MOCA curricula. You'll see here that although the program was designed for Black American men, some Latinx folks made up about 22% of the sample, and I'll touch on this in a minute. The most notable characteristics of the study participants were really the difficult circumstances in which these folks live. We started this work with an aim to engage low-income folks, as defined by the federal poverty standards, but very quickly realized that a lot of the folks that were coming in through our doors and interacting with the curriculum and becoming participants reported much less sort of than we anticipated. And so we're living in very drastically different realities than what we expected. we really were working with folks that were surviving at the margins and then creating cohorts of people that were really there to sort of support each other. And so these are these are unpublished preliminary analyses that we're working to finalize and get the word out. But our work does show promising trends so far. For both groups combined, the MoCA intervention resulted in significant reductions in stress, both self-reported and fingernail cortisol. So this was pre-test and post-test. For both groups combined again, the MoCA intervention resulted in significant reduction in systolic blood pressure from pre-test to 3-month follow-up. And for men assigned to the MoCA original condition, they experienced significant reductions in stress, anxiety, depression, as well as in BMI. Importantly, our simple trend analysis, which also combined both groups, suggested that changes in both self-reported and objectively measured stress, as well as BMI and blood pressure, all were correlated to increases in community connectedness and the reduction of social isolation over time. And so when I mean that, or when I say that we were really creating cohorts, we were really creating social connection and social connectedness and creating social capital as part of what we were doing here. And so the most promising and significant changes really were driven by the program intervention effects on social support, community connectedness, and social isolation. So simply creating a venue in which men, providing the space in which men could come together and speak vulnerably about some of these things, that may have been the catalyzing factor in our entire intervention. And so right now we're immersed in the analyses and we're about to ramp up our dissemination process for some of this work. This includes some intensive rounds of community presentations that we're planning for the late spring and the summer. Our work also has resulted in really exciting next steps. The first of which is a 5-year state-funded project for MoCA to engage in work that disrupts systemic and structural racism, as well as my leading of an administrative diversity supplement to expand this work of MoCA into the Latinx community, and our subsequent submission of a follow-up R01 with Latino men. And then also the creation of the Ghana's Health Initiative of Color, the Ghana's Health Initiative for Men of Color, which I'm going to explain a little bit further. So briefly, at the beginning of last year, we received a 5-year award for MoCA to continue its work in disrupting systemic racism. Through our NIMHD funding initiatives, we've really been able to leverage these federal funds to improve upon MoCA's working infrastructure and MoCA's reach and scale up efforts to engage with a broader community in impactful ways. And so the vision for this work is driven by 3-pronged approach. The first was that there's an investment in sustainability and community capacity and in nurturing movement leaders. We've allocated a large fraction of our funds toward training and growth opportunities for MoCA mentors that we've been able to send folks virtually or otherwise to leadership and organizing trainings. And so while our academic community partnership has been fruitful, if we are really to work ourselves out of a job, we need to really invest in community development. We've also reframed the MoCA curriculum to be a 5-week intensive introduction to community organizing. And so the core of the MoCA curriculum remains. However, we believe that it's important to politicize health and health disparities in order to build upon a vanguard of change. And we're piloting this new curriculum right now. The second piece is the creation of affinity groups based on expressed community needs. We are leveraging the infrastructure that we've created and all this people power that we've also created to build and foster special interest groups that are going to work toward common goal, but in very specific topic areas such as housing insecurity, voting rights, COVID-19 mitigation, employment security, et cetera. This also helps us continue to foster the social connectedness and solidarity that's been built from our previous work. And the third is the expansion of our work into allied communities. And so we felt that it was necessary to build into our work a community education component to foster constructive dialogue with communities that are allied, that are allies to what we're building, excuse me, or that have parallel interests. The second piece is also, I've covered the affinity groups. And the expansion of the efforts into the Latinx community. So this is now talking about Mocha Latino and what's resulted of a diversity supplement that I received earlier. And so these are we've expanded the efforts into the Latinx community, and it's been a long-term goal of Mocha and the local community for some time. So as such, I led the administrative diversity supplement that allowed for the formative work needed to replicate these Mocha-based efforts with Latino men. So we aim to further expand the minority stress model to capture the factors that govern the stress related to health outcomes of Latino men. And we needed to adapt the MOCA program to be responsive to the unique needs of men. In the interest of time, I'll note that data from this analysis are ongoing, and that we've developed the curriculum based on these data. Colleagues and I have set out to acquire R01 funding for this work. We've submitted twice now to really, I think is a good reception. So we've been just under the pay line, and we've had some really valuable pink sheets. So we have some feedback to move forward. So hopefully third time's the charm. We're submitting again in June of this year through the same mechanism, and hope we've learned sort of some good lessons throughout the process, and that we are able to bring this funding to fruition. And so I'll just shift gears a little bit, apologies there. Arguably, however, at the moment, the most important and most exciting, for me at least, result of all the work that I've really summarized are the next steps and the creation of the Ganas initiative. So the word ganas in Spanish means desire. So tons of research has really shown us that men, and particularly men of color, and more specifically Latino men, have a strong interest, or ganas, to live healthier lives, to live longer, to find fulfillment, to become more present for family, for work, and for ourselves, really. We also know that the problem is not necessarily that men don't know how to achieve healthier life, but that finding and getting help that speaks to us is difficult. So that's where the Ganas program, or Ganas, comes in. This is the culmination of work that's been happening for the better part of the last decade to really develop gender transformative health programs for men that are grounded in community, in critical consciousness building, and that are meant to help folks disentangle manhood and masculinity and take control of their health in a way that simultaneously addresses physical, mental, social well-being, as well as community collective advocacy in ethical, sustainable, and scalable ways. The first component is the development of this gender transformative modular intervention for Latino men. Very briefly, gender transformative interventions create opportunities for men to challenge gender norms and how they impact their health. And this has been shown to be a very promising approach, mostly in transitional age male identified folks, and specifically for the prevention of intimate partner violence prevention and sexual health risk behavior, and for sexual health risk behaviors. But our extensive formative work, as well as most of the relevant literature, suggests that this approach specifically, with some strategic tailoring and some supplementation, can also have positive impacts on other health risk behaviors in diverse and heterogeneous groups of Latinx men of different age ranges. And so we recently received some seed funding to run a pilot feasibility and preliminary efficacy trial of a gender transformative intervention of a set of modules to address a collection of adverse health behaviors with Latino men. We also receive funding to address the responsiveness of this program and to really hone in our health risk communication strategies and address the potential impact of this program on these men. The intention is really that all these data can lead to an ARC-34 or similar development grant that's going to allow us to scale up this formative work in a more precise manner and really build a scalable interventions for different populations of Latinx men across the country. This work locally is in partnership with an organization called Nueva Esperanza, and they are out of Holyoke, Massachusetts, and they work primarily with the Puerto Rican community, and they work with an emphasis of creating new opportunities through social justice, community education, really focus on leadership, prosperity, and sort of an overall well-being. And our collaboration has also catalyzed the establishment of a permanent health resource center, a men's health resource center, in which we're calling the Ganas Health Resource Center, which is going to be meeting the long time expressed needs of community, and it's going to function as a mutually beneficial community engaged service and research hub for a lot of some of our future projects. So briefly, to date, there are no interventions specifically focused on reducing health risk behaviors by addressing sort of this disentangling of self-conceptualizations of masculinity that are specifically designed for Latino men. And so the objective of this work really is to do some of the formative research toward the development and testing of linguistically, regionally, and social culturally responsive interventions to reduce adverse health behaviors among this population. And so we've developed and we are beta testing a set of gender transformative health behavior programs through, intervention modules that we are calling the Ganas Project. And so we're using engagement and communication strategies that have been identified as responsive to our target population. And we are piloting this sort of adapted protocol to examine the feasibility of both implementation and also receptibility from of the materials with our target community. And we're going to triangulate our data and really assess sort of this cultural and gender responsiveness of this adaptive protocol by doing some follow-up focus groups with participants. The Latinx population is one of the largest and fastest growing racial groups in the United States. And the exponential growth of chronic disease and related implications in this community, there really is warranted urgency to find viable interventions for this population. We've had several a look at the literature and all of our formative work, and sort of the foundation that we're building really points to the direction of the need and fundability of programs like this. So our sort of to briefly cover our module intervention, the first piece is really to introduce men to the Ganas Project. We're beginning to explore masculinity, what it means to be a Latino man, to examine the social pressures of adopting rigid gender roles. And then we're also using a photo voice component as part of all of our project, our entire project. The module 2, or the second module, is identity in place. So exploring shared Latinx historical contexts. We're going to share and compare individual familial migration stories, identify and describe links between colonization and health, and today's sort of present focus related to migration and movement. And we're going to question how shared historical contexts affect historical and current views of manhood and masculinity, and how these affect health. The third is the politicization of health. We're really describing how health of communities of color are impacted by imperialist, capitalist, heteronormative patriarchy, and understanding how gender and race, ethnicity, and other factors influence how much power people have and how this affects our health. Module 4 is taking control of our health, lifestyle strategies toward healthier future. So we're recognizing different health-seeking behaviors and understanding the importance of maintaining health-seeking behaviors, and really discussing, well, what are the harmful forces that drive these behaviors that some men exercise. And the fifth is to build community solidarity, right? Building community and solidarity across groups, and really thinking of well, how are we going to build sustainability into these types of programs, along with community, specifically in this localized setting? So we're going to discuss what we can do as a community to improve our health, provide an entry point for continuing to disseminate this information, to discuss what we're going to do to create sustainability around the creation of these discussion, and to really develop community-led action steps to lead into some sustainability with these cohorts that we're building. Importantly, because this is formative work, the approach to address diverse health behaviors in Latino men really is intentionally broad. The literature on the matter really is scarce. So this work is at the vanguard of what we're doing. Nevertheless, given the insight provided by our previous work, the GANAS intervention will address two scopes related to health behaviors. So this is high-risk alcohol consumption and sexual risk, as well as dietary intake and poor physical activity behaviors, because these not only hold sort of the most promise for a behavior change intervention of its kind, but are also behaviors that are at the root of preventable disease that Latino men are disproportionately burdened by. So that said, the data gathered through this formative work is intentionally versatile and holds promise for scalability into an NIH-funded research track. And the work that we're doing now is to really identify exactly which institute we're going to direct our efforts in. The big picture here, however, is that this multifaceted approach that we're taking to create sustainable and responsive scalable programs, right? And in terms of local sustainability, part of the pilot is to take a peer-to-peer, train-to-trainer approach. And so we're going to be recruiting men from the first cohort of folks to be trained into the delivery of these modules with the organization that we're working along with. And we're also taking a really grounded approach to meet the expressed needs of community beyond sort of our formative data. This program has been developed through a series of critical conversations with community to meet community needs. And using this modular approach really allows the program to be nimble so that future renditions can really adapt to the needs of community no matter where they are. And most importantly, we're really developing a highly scalable program. So our formative work has allowed us to identify the pivotal points we can use to tailor these types of programs to heterogeneous groups of Latinos. So that, and we're going to be putting that to the test through a web-delivered randomized control trial, which is one of the first kind of planned tangents of this work. Relatedly, our collective efforts to better meet the health needs of Latino men, I'm leading in beta launch of a web-based national Latino men's health resource hub. So we're leveraging existing resources. ganashealth.org is going to be a one-stop resource hub that's going to be widely marketed to men of color as a space for and by men of color in an effort to curate mental, physical, and social health resources that are responsive to these specific needs. And this is also going to be the primary outlet for a collection to house a collection of interactive, web-based, gender transformative workshops for Latino men. And this is what's, part of what's currently being piloted along with Nueva Esperanza. And so this is going to ensure that we're going to be able to responsibly and ethically consider the scalability of these programs with diverse populations. And the goal is that ganashealth.org, it really allows us an opportunity to hone these recruitment, engagement, and delivery of these interventions, which are really going to allow us the acquiring of more and more data to be used in sort of future external funding proposals. Lastly, is the generating of discourse both in the academy and public spheres. We're doing this by engaging in the field in a discussion about reflexivity in men's health research and how patriarchy is embedded in and really biases our collective work. And we're also generating public discourse using social media outlets to help men create dialogue about disentangling their masculinity and how they rewrite their own narratives through sort of our social media sort of a sphere that we also are creating in parallel. And that's what I have for today. So thank you so much for your attention and the space again. And I'm happy to take questions and or comments now.
That's great. We get some virtual applause, some people on mute, some people not. That's you had everyone's attention, I'll tell you, Luis. That was great. I had a couple questions, but let me open it up to, I know people here have comments and questions. I saw some other applause, but anybody want to jump in with a comment or questions for Luis? Near? See.
Sure, that was stunning. Where do you find the time? um,
I don't. I don't sleep.
That was really stunning. I thought about maybe a direction for the future. It's not really a challenge in any way or whatever. I just had an interesting conversation yesterday with a current, I think she's the chair or interim chair of the psychology department at Princeton. And I've learned more about the possibilities of doing research on norms that one wants to try to instill in a community by directing. So basically she does cluster randomized trials on, in her case, school bullying and what she does is she directs the intervention to an index case who she checked in advance is likely to be somebody based on testimony, in her case, testimonies for students or whatever, is likely to be more influential than other actors. So that, and you know, that's a potentially more cost-effective way of trying to spread a norm or spread a, so, you know, personnel, you know, you started out with a macho kind of thinking out of the man box thing. If there is interventions to tackle that, maybe things of that sort. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm actually in conversations right now with a new mentor of mine, and so she's historically worked on physical activity and diet intervention in faith-based organizations, and so she has sort of that in to do this more community sort of norm changing intervention work, and we are in conversations to do something along the lines of this gender transformative sort of message, health risk communication message delivery through faith-based organizations. And so these are sort of preliminary conversations that we're having, but I think that would be, you know, I think I completely agree that we need to find also so the work that I do is resource and time intensive, right? So we are, you know, taking people, not necessarily one by one, but creating these cohorts of folks. But, you know, we really need to be able to take some of this work into spaces where people are already gathering, right? So faith-based organizations also at times are some of the spaces in which sort of this gender transformative knowledge building needs to take place. And there are folks that are amenable to that. And so I think that's going to be one of the next pieces of this is really, so, you know, we're honing in on some of our messaging right now. And once we have that down pat, then we are going to be able to send really more strategically select spaces where we can do the delivery of some of this intervention. And I think really thinking from a community-based perspective or more of a community intervention, not so much very individualized as we're doing right now, that it's going to have a larger effect, and especially in some of these places, right? So agreeing with you, this, you know, if you take these influential folks that like can really be embedded in these communities to really change norms and change the discourse around some of these things that have been persistently hard to change, that I think that we could have a broader and more potentially a you know, broader, less resource intensive impact for sure.
Professor Stevens, I see your hands up.
Yes, Dr. Valdez, that was an amazing presentation. So I am the director right now of an Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice here at Rutgers, and we have launched a one-year research project called Black Bodies, Black Health that tries to bring biomedical researchers, humanists, and social scientists together to talk about race and structural racism and health. So I just want to say how impressed I was at the complexity of the MOCHA project. And I think my question is to ask you if you could say a little bit, everything you shared about what it has been able to do is so, just right on point, and moving between those different levels, the systemic, the personal, gender discourse, so very humanities kind of discourse, and then individual behavior and practice. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how is it the team, just what were were you able to manage these different levels of a discussion in how you conceived of the project? Is it something started out wholesale that way, or did you kind of layer on as you thought through the research process? Just a little bit more about that would just be fascinating.
Sure. I'll see. That's a sort of career building question, right? Like, how did you do that? But I think I'll share. I guess part of the trajectory has, I think that the approach that historically has been taken is that we pathologize bodies of color, and we pathologize folks, and we pathologize behaviors, and we try to act on that pathway, right? So how do we change someone's very specific behavior to in a way that we find that is going to be health protective or health beneficial? And really historically throwing resources at like that piece of the path, not really knowing sort of like the environments and the norms that these behaviors are embedded in, that they exist, that they're nested in this larger picture. And so part of at least for me, I've always seen the big picture in terms of needing to build critical consciousness in if we're talking about individualized interventions, which a lot of the work has been, is really making critical consciousness part of the discourse, so part of whatever intervention delivery. And so if I can talk a little bit about the animal intervention, for instance, and there was this idea that we were taking the diabetes prevention program, which was this large American Diabetes Association and YMCA partnership, and they put together this evidence-based program for diet and physical activity for folks from all over the place, which was successful for Latinx communities, but did not recruit well enough for us to be able to say that's part of the evidence base of the work. And so when we took that on, so we took the diabetes prevention program and we wanted to tailor it to the community, but not just in language and culture responsiveness, but also in, well, what are these behaviors that we want to change embedded in, and how can we even just have conversations about like what environments people are embedded in, and what environments people are needing to change their behaviors, right? And so it became, I think that piece was a big kind of wake up call about what we were really doing, right? So like, if men were coming in and talking to our sort of lifestyle coaches about their adult children were ODing, and or somebody was deported, and the reason why they didn't adhere to the dietary restrictions that week was because because they had been deported and they needed to come back, and it was just like this entire this cluster of other stresses that had nothing to do with the dietary intake that we really needed to step back and cover better. And so the idea of creating a gender transformative approach that also encompasses other systemic things like racism and discrimination, and really being able to tackle that, is just to build consciousness to say, well, what are all of my behaviors embedded in as an individual, and for us as researchers to see the realities that folks live, and then to try to maybe compartmentalize, right, these spaces, or to really think of everything like spaghetti and be like, everything is this mixed pot, and we're going to be able to change these things and not change these other things in order to create, collective advocacy, right? So like if you create from hopelessness some hope, from agency, so we create agency as a community, which then sort of trickles down into individualized behaviors, right? So we're trying to create community-wide change first, and then the individualized behaviors follow. But again, it's a complicated thing. I think that I could try to answer your question over another hour's long conversation, but it's big picture. We just published this this piece about the minority stress model that we're expanding upon for Latinx men, which explains some of how we're thinking about this, which I'm happy to share with you, so you can take a look at sort of how we're modeling, how we're thinking about the big picture of how all these things are intersected. So thank you.
No, thank you. Phenomenal work.
Thank you, Luis. Other comments, ideas?
You can see, Luis, we are very tough here.
Out of ignorance, I had a quick question, Luis. How did you, or maybe you could comment on measuring community connectedness or measuring social isolation? You know, how do you measure it in a way that you can then put it into controlling for it or looking at it as an outcome?
Sure, we have a variety of measures that we use, and pardon me for not having the scales in my frontal lobe right now, but we use two different scales, and we also use it's a more interactive app-based it's sort of a social network builder that then allows participants to think about and isolate who is part of their direct social network, sort of, you know, to really measure the social capital of people that they have at the beginning of our project. And then we use the same sort of interactive approach at the end of the project, and then we compare that. So I mean, I get that the best answer that I could give you that is we use a compound of three different measures to really look at social connectedness, decrease social isolation, and then we use this other newer social network measure that we are. I wouldn't say that we're at the head of, but we're one of the first few labs that are exploring that work.
Okay, yeah, I'm just asking out of ignorance, as I said. So anybody else want to jump in? Vince from Israel, or Charles from
Rick,
Fine Room?
the only I was gonna say, Rick, the only thing I would do is go ahead and give the same thank you and welcome speech that you will do anyway. So I'll leave it to you this time. Okay. Except to say, very nice job, Luis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles.
Luis, I'd like to thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
You've cut out, Charles.
You got cut off.
Still nothing. I can tell this question is going to be good.
We can't hear you, Charles. We heard your first few words and then it cut out. Whoops. Now we lost him altogether. Oh, here he comes. Is that better now? You're on mute.
Luis, I can tell you it's going to be a really good question though, because
Right, yeah. I'm on the edge of my seat now.
I'm sorry.
Charles, but type it in the chat.
There he is. Now I
Okay,
can hear him.
can you all hear me now? I'm sorry, I
Yes.
just lost. Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Valdez. I wanted to ask you, given where you are in the tenure track, how do you balance the time and commitment and frankly uncertainty of community-based work against the traditional productivity measures that tenure track professors are typically assessed against?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think I think that's what I lose sleep over most nights is really trying to do genuine community-based. My work is from community engaged to community led, and so building these relationships takes time, and building the rapport takes time, and it does take a lot of time sort of outside of the space. I think that I'll say that. Because of my approach to all of my work is, from a community organizing perspective, that a lot of what I do sort of on my day-to-day, my sort of life outside of work is embedded out in the community, right? So like I show up and I am existing, and a lot of what, my family does is exist in the community. And so that a lot of those relationships and a lot of that relationship building that's happening, like those are mine and our folks that, and so that it's a whole lot less about, can I carve time out of work to build these relationships, and a whole lot more about my work is, the parameters for, tenure are being fulfilled, or and I'm also, as part of sort of my life is like this embedding into these communities and being part of community. And so but it's an incredibly hard thing to balance because of the sort of the metrics that we have to meet for tenure, and needing to carve out time to write, and needing to make sure that enough grants are in, and needing to make sure that I have money to cover A, B, and C. That is a lot of the system is not necessarily built to support this type of work. But I'm finding a way, right? So like thus far, I've been able to hustle my way to where I am now, and again, I lose sleep absolutely because it's because it feels like I have I'm not just diving into data sets and producing and then pulling from here and there. Like I have to be out in the community, and I have to build these relationships, and at the same time, I have to, and so for me, a lot of my work is collaborative, right? So I lead a lot of these projects, but I also have to become increasingly good at delegating tasks, and having a lot of students in my lab that have a well-oiled machine that's like functioning really well, and I can sort of extend my efforts outside of myself, which I think is really helpful. But I guess like the most brief and most real answer to the question is that it's complicated. It's complicated to be able to straddle that, to be genuinely embedded and working for and by and with the best interests of community, and also try to meet the metrics of where I am in my tenure trajectory. Absolutely, but it's working. So
thank you.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it was worth waiting for, Charles. That was a tough question, complicated, but yeah, a key one for Luis and for anyone doing community involved and community engaged and community-based research. But thank you all. We're past time, but I wanted to thank Luis very much for his time and his presentation. As you could tell, people were really obviously very interested and wanted to stay on here. Others had to jump because of the timing, but wanted to thank you again for joining us and teaching us. And we appreciate the time, and talk to you soon. Yeah.
Thank you, folks.